Tonight on Bridge City News, Lethbridge police have launched an investigation after an 8-year-old boy was sexually assaulted at Henderson Lake. Federal Conservative leader Andrew Scheer blasted Prime Minister Justin Trudeau over the Liberals' rejection of the amendments of Bill C-69. And the Lethbridge Hurricanes have announced their preseason schedule. We have the details.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Robbins.
Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. Lethbridge police are investigating after an 8-year-old boy was sexually assaulted in a public washroom at Henderson Lake. Police say the event took place on the evening of June 1st when the boy, who was at a party at the time, was approached by an older man in his 60s. After being offered candy, the boy followed the suspect into the washroom. It was then that the sexual assault occurred. Following the incident, police say a witness observed the male with the boy near the water and called the boy to come back to the party. The male appeared quite nervous and quickly walked north toward the parking lot. The suspect is described as a Caucasian male in his 60s, around 5'7" tall, with a slim build and clean-cut white hair. He was wearing light beige cargo shorts, a white and red plaid shirt, and white running shoes. Police ask anyone who was at Henderson Lake Park on June 1st between 6 and 10 p.m. to call them right away at 403-328-4444. A Lethbridge woman who stabbed her mother following an argument 3 years ago has been granted full parole. In 2016, Jessica Leanne Prail was charged with second-degree murder in connection with the attack on 54-year-old Shelley Christine Prail at the elder Prail's home in North Lethbridge. The mother was taken to hospital where she later died from her injuries. The daughter, who was 28 years old at the time of the attack, was arrested at the scene. The accused pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of manslaughter and was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Canola has been a hot topic of conversation the past couple of months. Last April, China banned Canadian canola producers from importing into their country. That move impacted the industry in a big way, since 40% of Canada's canola goes to China. The Canola Council of Canada remains positive, however, and is looking at expanding into other markets in Asia, including Japan and South Korea. They recently returned from a trip to Seoul, South Korea.
It's really important in Asia that we keep strong relations. Relationships are very important in the Asian culture, in Japan and Korea specifically. And being there to talk face-to-face with our customers is of the utmost importance. We had a great chance to do that when we were there. We had a very good opportunity to understand what's happening in Korea and the vegetable oil market and how we fit as canola and how we can grow that share over time. When it comes to market access to China, the Canola Council leads our efforts on behalf of the whole canola industry. So this includes producers and growers, it includes life science companies, it includes our exporters as well as processors. So we represent the whole industry and bring together the industry to find solutions to market access problems like we're having with our canola seed going to China.
South Korea is the third largest market for Canadian canola oil. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Conservative leader Andrew Scheer sparred and question period over a Liberal bill to overhaul the assessment process for major energy projects like pipelines. The Liberals rejected many amendments Conservative senators recommended for Bill C-69.
Mr. Speaker, the fundamental responsibility of any Prime Minister, indeed anyone who aspires to be Prime Minister, is to defend national unity and keep the country together. So the Leader of the Opposition should condemn the Conservative premiers who so blithely stated and make claims about threats to national unity if they don't get their way. The issue at hand, Mr. Speaker, is Conservatives don't think that in order to move forward with resource projects, you have to be mindful of the environment and you have to partner with Indigenous peoples. We disagree. Indeed, we think it's the only way to move forward.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, this Prime Minister is causing the problem. He's the one that is causing divisions between regions and polarizing Canadians. He's acting like someone who sets fire to a house and then lashes out at the people calling in the fire department. It's his policies that have killed the Northern Gateway project, that killed Energy East, and now has had to use taxpayers' dollars to purchase a decades-old pipeline. When will he realize that it's his policies that are hurting the energy sector and leading to men and women being out of work because of his policies?
Husky Energy has been fined $3.8 million for a pipeline leak that spilled into a major river and tainted the drinking water for thousands of people in Saskatchewan. The spill into the North Saskatchewan River in 2016 forced the cities of North Battleford, Prince Albert, and Melfort to shut off their water intakes for almost 2 months. The Calgary-based company pleaded guilty yesterday to 3 environmental charges.
We recognize that the spill had a significant impact on communities along the North Saskatchewan River, and we're deeply sorry for that. And we've been working hard since that day to try to set things right. There's no doubt that it has had a detrimental effect on Husky's reputation and on the industry as a whole, and that's very, very unfortunate. You know, we took this very seriously. We took responsibility for it. We have expended a lot of money on the cleanup, over $140 million, as you heard in there. We have, been working hard to try to make things right, but the damage is done, absolutely.
There is a new chief in town. The city of Lethbridge is getting ready to say goodbye to outgoing Fire Chief Rich Hildebrand while making way for Deputy Fire Chief Mark Rathwell. Rathwell will take over the duties of overseeing the Lethbridge Fire Department and EMS.
I'm extremely honored to represent our community as Fire Chief for Lethbridge Fire and Emergency Services. Huge shoes to fill after retiring Chief Hildebrand. He's a tough act to follow, so I hope I can do him proud and just as importantly do the community proud and the rest of the guys on the floor. We've got a great team at the executive level and as well as on the floor, and it's going to be a lot of work for me, and I'm up to the challenge and really excited about it.
To be honest, I have some mixed feelings, there's no doubt. I'm looking forward to the next stage of life, starting a new chapter with my wife and my daughters, and spending a lot of time with the family in new adventures. But at the same time, there's no doubt that when you grow up in this department and you grow up wearing this uniform, it becomes part of you, and I'll miss the chief.
Rathwell officially began his duties as Fire Chief this past Monday, and Hildebrand will remain with the department until August when he retires. After 40 years of tenure, Lethbridge's city clerk will work her final day tomorrow. Alida Neufeld prepared for her last city council meeting on Monday. Over the last 4 decades, she says she has seen it all.
Lots of changes in 40 years. I personally have worked for 3 different mayors through various numbers of councillors, but it has been an amazing career, and I feel very blessed in 40 years that there's not very mornings I have woken up and not wanted to go to work. I have had an amazing career, and I have loved every day of working for this corporation.
In Alberta, clerks organize council and city committee meetings, advise councillors on the best ways to run meetings, and help word bylaws to meet the standards of the Municipal Government Act. Between the north, south, and west sides of Lethbridge, there are currently 7 road construction projects creating delays for motorists. Numerous complaints on social media focused on the Mayor McGrath and Whoop Up Drive projects. The City of Lethbridge wants to remind residents that many of these projects happen every year and cannot be avoided.
Really, we've tried to communicate with the public as best we can, and the property owners as best we can, 24 hours or more, telling them that we are doing the paving. Be tolerant when you know that we're doing the paving. We're always trying to accommodate the traffic to go through. It might just take you a few minutes longer. So in general, Mayor McGrath Drive is a good example. We drive that on a regular basis. Our foremen are driving that on a regular basis to make sure we're not unreasonably delaying people. It's 10 to 12 minutes extra in your day. Whoop Up Drive is a bridge rehab project, which is one defined area right across the bridge. And all we're doing with Bridge Drive rehab is we're taking 3 lanes of traffic down to 2 lanes of traffic for across the bridge. And people are actually working daytimes, they're working underneath the bridge, so people don't see the contractors working, but they're working underneath the bridge doing a bridge girder coating project. So that's why people aren't seeing construction workers working, because they're underneath the bridge.
The City of Lethbridge often tweets about daily delays and to leave some extra time in your schedule when they come. The final report of a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is calling for widespread changes to the way the justice system handles cases. This includes standardized response times, better communication with family members, and to strict protocols to ensure investigations are thorough and complete. At SACPA today, a speaker elaborated on the devastating crisis and Canada's call to action.
I have a theme of walking together, of reconciliation. So not only do we talk about the report, but I somewhat highlight an element of the truth and reconciliation calls to action, as well as just a greater understanding and awareness of Indigenous people, history, culture, language, and I am First Nations as well, so I fit into that category. I'm a Blackfoot woman, and so these findings and these calls for justice certainly apply to myself and our community.
Fox says that despite best efforts to gather information related to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, the report concludes that no one knows the exact number. Every year on June 15th, World Elder Abuse Awareness Day is commemorated. Northbridge Senior Centre honored the day a little early today in a unique way. As BCN's Loris Alexander reports, this story had a bit of a unique twist.
Today in Lethbridge, we're bringing attention to elder abuse. So the actual date is June the 15th, and it's recognized around the world to acknowledge those seniors who are in situations of abuse or neglect. So today, Northbridge is helping us to celebrate or to bring attention to the fact that there is elder abuse in Lethbridge, in Alberta, in the country, and across the world.
It is a worldwide issue. It's not just isolated within Lethbridge, Alberta, or Canada. It's a worldwide issue that police services across the country and internationally do take serious because they are a marginalized group, and we do need to make sure that our seniors are taken care of and that they are felt like they're an important contributing member of society.
Just last year, the Lethbridge Elder Abuse Response Network says they've responded to approximately 100 calls of elder abuse.
It's still a very silent thing that's happening, and if you have compassion and if you love seniors, it's important. We all have a passion for it, and it needs to keep going, and actually there needs to be legislation for it, and it has to be really considered. There needs to be consequences for actions in elder abuse because it hurts.
For Bridge City News, I'm Loris Alexander.
The Lethbridge Hurricanes have released their 2019 preseason schedule. The Canes will play a total of 4 games on the exhibition sked. On September 6th and 7th, they'll play home-and-home series against the Red Deer Rebels. Friday, September 13th, Lethbridge will play the Swift Current Broncos at the NMAC Centre, and then the next day they travel to Swift Current for the rematch. The full 2019-2020 regular season schedule will be released at a later date. We all know that cheese begins with milk, but how does it get from the cow to our grocery store? BCN's Jeanette Rocher visited a nearby cheese farm run by a local family, and they showed us the whole process of how cheese is made.
Say cheese. For the Buyer family, it's all in a day's work at Crystal Springs Cheese, located just outside of Lethbridge. The local Alberta family-run business is currently one of Western Canada's leaders in feta production.
Yes, we make feta is our main one. We do Goudas, we do Havardis, we do Cheddars. Those are all pretty much just farmers market items. We have a farm right next door. We have just over 100 cows. It gets pumped over through a line going from the barn to the cheese plant. It's only about like 400 feet away. So it literally gets pumped into our tanks over here. We pasteurize the milk and it goes into the cheese vats and yogurt vats. The biggest launch we've had in the last, actually March 1st, we took over a brand called Bleswald Yogurt. So it's very exciting. So the yogurt is actually it's a completely natural yogurt. So very different than your typical yogurts. We're actually taking, our plain yogurt only has 3 ingredients. It's milk, skim milk powders, and cultures. So that's one of the only yogurts that's on the market that has so few ingredients.
It's a long process for some of the cheeses. Gouda takes months, whereas the curds take a day. From there, they get bagged and vacuum sealed, then sent to the stores and into your cart. For Bridge City News, I'm Jeanette Rocher.
A committee of MPs has decided not to call for seatbelts to be installed in Canadian school buses. Instead, they say further study is needed. The House of Commons Transportation Committee launched an investigation into bus safety, including school buses, following the deadly Humboldt Broncos bus crash last year that killed 16 and injured 13 others. The final report says safety requirements need beefing up for passenger buses. The committee, however, said conflicting evidence from experts about seatbelts in school buses points to the need for further study. Unions that represent bus drivers raised concerns about liability when it comes to making sure kids are properly secured. Cost was another complaint, with estimates for retrofitting buses pegged between $8,000 and $20,000 per bus. Many across the country are getting frustrated with more studies and say seatbelts are needed now. Gary Lilico, a bus driver in BC, has collected close to 100,000 signatures on change.org calling for mandatory school bus seatbelts. The Public Health Agency of Canada says 11,577 people died from apparent opioid-related overdoses between January of 2016 and December of 2018. It also says close to 4,500 people died in 2018 alone, with many of the deaths related to the contamination of the illegal drug supply. The agency says there was a large increase in death rates between January of 2016 and June of 2017. It also said Western Canada remains the most affected region of the country and that fentanyl continues to be a major driver of the crisis. Chief of Defence Staff General Jonathan Vance presided over the Royal Canadian Navy change of command ceremony yesterday. He passed the command from Vice Admiral Ron Lloyd to Vice Admiral Art MacDonald.
This, ladies and gentlemen, is very much a part of the business of our military family, to foster and grow great leadership and maintain the continuity of command. It's about command. We will celebrate the next steps in the lives of two remarkable sailors, Vice Admiral Ron Lloyd and Art MacDonald. As we have seen over the course of all of our careers, we live in a complex and ever-changing world, and for that, we need a potent, agile, responsive Navy.
I'm humbled and I'm honored to relieve my friend and mentor to assume the watch as Commander RCN and to be charged with caring for and enabling the amazing Canadians who are RCN sailors.
2 oil tankers near the Strait of Hormuz were damaged in suspected attacks today as tensions between Washington and Tehran heightened. The assault left one of the tankers ablaze and adrift as sailors were evacuated from both vessels, with the U.S. Navy coming to assist in the rescue effort. Last night, the St. Louis Blues captured their very first Stanley Cup championship on the road, beating the Boston Bruins in Boston 4-1. Hopefully tonight, the Toronto Raptors can capture their first championship on the road as they take on the Golden State Warriors. Raptors coach Nick Nurse says his team is excited heading into Game 6.
I'll say this, I'm absolutely thrilled to be coaching in another finals game. This is awesome, right? You know, you watch the game and you pull out the most learning experiences you can, you know, about 20 to 25 on defense and 18 to 22 on offense, and then a good segment, maybe 15 or so on special teams, and just go through them like any game.
You know, for us, we just go out there and we try to play our game the same way, no matter home or on the road. You know, we understand on the road we got to be even more better because of, you know, the situation. But for us, as a group, we just go in there, we stay focused and stay locked in on that moment of being on the road and being together.
Hopefully the Toronto Raptors can win their first NBA championship tonight. A sunny and hot day in Lethbridge, but cooler temperatures are on the way. Complete weather details are coming up. Sun mixed with cloud today and hot. Tonight, a good chance of showers developing with a low near 12.
Tomorrow, showers tapering off with a high near 22. A nice weekend is shaping up. Sunshine at 23 for Saturday, sunny and even hotter 27 degrees on Sunday. A low pressure system moves in Monday, bringing rain and a high of 24. Tuesday, more showers are expected and a high near 19. Showers and 16 degrees for Wednesday. Looking at the almanac, the average high for this time of year is 22 and an average low of 9. The highest temperature on this date was recorded in 1987 at 32 degrees, and the record low was +1 in 1969. Sunrise was at 5:24, sunset at 9:39. Let's see how tomorrow's shaping up across the country now. Mostly cloudy and 22 degrees for Victoria, clearing and 21 for Vancouver on Friday. A chance of thunder showers at 22 for Calgary. Rain at 22 as well for Edmonton. Thunder showers at 27 degrees for Regina. Rain at 23 for Saskatoon tomorrow. Thunder showers at 25 is on tap for Winnipeg. Toronto will also receive rain and should see a high near 22. Ottawa will have light showers at 18. Rain at 18 degrees as well for Montreal. In the Maritimes, Fredericton, New Brunswick will have periods of drizzle and 21 tomorrow. Halifax, Nova Scotia will be mostly cloudy and 23. Charlottetown, PEI will have showers and 24. And in St. John's, Newfoundland, expect rain off and on and a high of only 9 degrees tomorrow. The federal government has rejected most of the amendments to Bill C-69, or as Premier Jason Kenney refers to it, the anti-pipeline bill. Many energy ministers across the country are not happy about it. Alberta Energy Minister Sonia Savage said the Liberals' rejection of the Senate's amendments are unacceptable and disappointing. Ontario's Energy Minister Greg Rickford calls the original Bill C-69 a misguided and job-killing piece of legislation. So I asked the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who covers stories from the legislature, what's next?
So this bill now goes back to the Senate, and they're going to go through it again. And it's quite a bit of consternation. A few days ago, Jason Kenney and a handful of other premiers, Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and Ontario, I believe, sent a letter to Trudeau saying, you know, in the interest of national unity, man, you've got to back off on this. And so, you know, this is a real showdown right now between the premiers and the Prime Minister, in addition to being a bit of a showdown between the members of Parliament and the senators.
Catch my full interview with Mr. Dawson discussing what's next for Bill C-69 coming up after Business News. The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers is projecting crude oil production in Western Canada will increase by more than 30% by the year 2035. Its latest forecast predicts total production will reach 5.76 million barrels a day. That is up from last year's 4.36 million. Production in Eastern Canada is forecast to peak at 354,000 barrels per day in 2026 before falling to about 91,000 in 2035. The report says capital investment in our country's oil and gas industry is forecast to fall to $37 billion in 2019 as constraints and regulations continue to hold back the energy sector. Dollarama says its first quarter revenue was up 9.5% to $828 million. The discount retailer says net earnings were up 2% to $103.5 million, or 33 cents per diluted share. Analysts predicted 34 cents. Comparable store sales grew 5.8% in the quarter. Dollarama had 1,236 stores at the end of the last quarter. That's up from 1,170 stores a year ago. Now, here's a look at today's markets. Recapping one of our top stories this hour, Lethbridge police are investigating after an 8-year-old boy was sexually assaulted in a public washroom at Henderson Lake. Police say the event took place on the evening of June 1st when the boy, who was at a party at the time, was approached by an older man in his 60s. After being offered candy, the boy followed the suspect into the washroom. It was then that the sexual assault occurred. Police ask anyone who was at Henderson Lake Park on June 1st between 6 and 10 p.m. to call them right away at 403-328-4444. There was a huge pro-energy rally which took place in Calgary recently. Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, was there, and we'll hear from Tyler what he had to say next. But first, here's a look at what's happening in and around your community.
Here's your Bridge City News Community Calendar. The McNally Community Association is presenting World of Whimsy, a fundraising gala tea and international hat fashion show on Saturday, June 15th from 2 to 4 p.m. at the McNally Community Center. Come for a fun time and the opportunity to win amazing door prizes, including a diamond pendant from Tompkins Jewelry, a champagne brunch and train ride at Aspen Crossing, and much more. Tickets are $35 and are available at Country Blooms Garden Center and the Jasmine Tea Room. For details, visit mcnallycommunity.ca. Father's Day at the Fort is taking place Sunday, June 16th from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. at Fort Group Up in Indian Battle Park. Bring your dad and take part in historical activities. Plus, South Alberta Horse Artillery will be performing in the afternoon. For more information, visit fort.galtmuseum.com. Come celebrate with your Latin American neighbors at the Festival Latino Lethbridge 2019, taking place Saturday, June 29th, beginning at noon at Exhibition Grounds, Pioneer Park. Presented by the Lethbridge Latin American Association, enjoy live entertainment, dance performances, traditional Latin food, and much more. All are welcome to this free event. For details, visit llaa.ca. And that's your Bridge City News Community Calendar.
Ottawa has rejected a lot of the amendments from the Senate in regards to Bill C-69, the bill that Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has referred to as the anti-pipeline bill. Only 62 of the more than 180 were accepted outright. Now, joining me now to discuss this is the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Tyler, it appears as though a lot of the Liberal Senator amendments were accepted, but many of the Conservative Senator tweaks, well, they were not.
That's right. Yeah. So this has been a long-running thing in federal politics and provincial politics here too. I mean, you might remember from the election campaign that Jason Kenney spoke a lot about this bill, which basically rejigs the approvals process for industry projects, including things like pipelines. And some industry players have worried and said that, you know, well, we might never be able to get a pipeline project built if this goes ahead. So the Senate studied this. It was in the Senate committee. The Senate committee made, as you said, over 180 recommendations on fixing this bill up. Finished up in the Senate, came back to the House of Commons. Now the House of Commons, as you said, accepted 62. Another 35-ish, give or take, amendments were also accepted in sort of a heavily modified form. So this bill now goes back to the Senate, and they're going to go through it again. And it's quite a bit of consternation. A few days ago, Jason Kenney and a handful of other premiers, Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and Ontario, I believe, sent a letter to Trudeau saying, you know, in the interest of national unity, man, you've got to back off on this. And so, you know, this is a real showdown right now between the premiers and the prime minister, in addition to being a bit of a showdown between the members of parliament and the senators.
And it's interesting, too. Didn't Trudeau call out the premiers saying, no, you have a problem with national unity. It's your fault.
He did, yeah. So, you know, this is, I think, the first time in my memory since Jason Kenney has been elected that there has been sort of such a back and forth between the prime minister and the premiers on this. And, you know, Kenney doubled down on this, and Trudeau said what he said going into, I believe it was the House of Commons yesterday. Nobody's particularly happy about this, but there are promises of lawsuits have been made by the provincial government here. So certainly Jason Kenney and his United Conservatives aren't backing down on this one.
So for journalists like you and I, this is a pretty exciting time, right?
Yeah, it really is.
Now, Tyler, there was a big pro-energy rally in Calgary recently outside of the Petroleum Show. Many of the protesters were worked up about Bill C-69, which we were just discussing, and C-48. Now, you were on the ground, boots on the ground. Tell me a bit about it.
I was, yeah. So I drove down to check it all out, and there were hundreds, at least, maybe thousands of people outside. The estimates, as is normal with these things, varied pretty considerably. But a whole roster of speakers. Premier Scott Moe is there, Alberta Energy Minister Sonia Savage, Ontario Energy Minister Greg Rickford, Ellis Ross, politician from British Columbia, and a former Haisla Nation councillor. And they all talked in sort of broad strokes about how they need a strong Alberta economy to themselves, you know, have robust economies and things like that. So they spoke about how they feel Bill C-69 should be scrapped, or at least heavily modified Bill C-48. They said, this isn't even salvageable. This is the tanker ban off the coast of British Columbia. And, you know, the crowd had their signs out, the Kill Bill C-69. They had, you know, pictures of Uma Thurman from the Quentin Tarantino film Kill Bill out there. So they were in good spirits. It was a relaxed crowd, but there was quite a bit of unity among these politicians. And, you know, I don't listen to BC politicians speak every day or Ontario politicians speak every day, but, you know, you hear some of the same talking points when you hear folks in Alberta from whatever political party speak at these sorts of things. But there is, you know, a diversity of argument coming from these people on what their concerns were on this stuff. So there is this coalition of premiers of Conservatives across Canada that represent an awful lot of Canadians and an awful lot of our GDP. This is something I think that Mr. Trudeau needs to keep an eye on.
An awful lot of clout, absolutely. Now, Tyler, the rail deal details have come out. Alberta's got to get its oil to market here, and the Kenney government has entered into discussions with private firms about paying for this. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, that's right. So this was a $3.7 odd billion deal that the New Democrats signed in very much in the waning days of their government. And Kenny claims that they paid above market rates to have Canadian Pacific and CNR shipping this oil by rail out to the coast. So the plan at the moment is to try and get the rail shippers to move those contracts over to private oil industry. So instead of the government footing a bill for these contracts, the private industry would pay that bill. Now, Kenny says that these are, confidential negotiations with industry, so he hasn't released scads and scads of details. But this was the first hint, I think, that we've got that they're not so much working on the political solution to this, but they are, which is, the back and forth and the condemning of the deal that the Democrats made, but rather they are meeting with executives and meeting with company officials and trying to get a deal hammered out in the private sector. So the final outcome on that remains to be seen, but well underway to undoing, I think, what Rachel Notley's New Democrats did.
A child welfare bill is proposing $10,000 in fines and 6 months in jail should an adult not report when a child is in need of intervention.
Yes, that's right. So you may remember what was called the Serenity's Law, I should say. And that was the young girl who, I believe she was 4 years old, died in care back in 2014 or so. Now, Mike Ellis, who's a UCP member of the legislature, had introduced this bill in the previous session, and it laid out fairly similar, almost identical, actually, ideas here, and basically to punish people for not notifying the authorities in cases where a child was endangered. Now, that didn't end up going through. The New Democrats sort of resisted a little bit, their argument being that they had concerns from the police and police unions about it. And so it never really, but it didn't become law, I should say. So it is back in the legislature with some small tweaks. The language in the previous bill suggested that an adult could report to the director of child services, for example. And Ellis has said that he thinks that's too complicated and that the police should be the people that could be contacted in this regard. The idea being that, well, I wouldn't even know how to find the phone number, say, for the local director of children's services if you wanted to report these things, whereas everyone knows how to get in contact with the police. So that's back before the legislature. That's part of this flurry of legislating that they are doing at the moment. We'll see where it goes, but that was a big controversy in the waning days of the last Conservative government and through the NDP years were children in care and child abuse. So, this is it's a hot topic once again, and with a majority, it seems likely that the UCP will be able to get this done.
The United Conservatives are considering returning driver testing to the private sector. Why is that?
Well, basically, the switch over in March that brought them all under government control, they're saying that there's these huge backlogs now and there isn't enough testers. So basically they're saying that, well, they moved too quickly and the system wasn't organized well enough, and now people, I guess, are having to wait to get their driver's testing done. So they're exploring, and Rick McIver criticized this, and simply put, they're exploring ways to fix the system and maybe return it to the way it was. So we sort of know what the problems are: not enough staff, backlogs, things like that. What the fix is going to be, we don't quite know. But certainly the possibility is being floated that it will return to the system that it was, really mere months ago.
Supply bills are coming. Now, why don't you explain to our viewers what exactly they are and their importance?
Yeah, so a supply bill basically keeps the government running. So people who read news from south of the border will know that sort of fairly regularly there's this big crisis in Washington when a shutdown is looming and the government can't pay its staff and people aren't going to work and this huge mess happens. So these interim supply bills basically come before the legislature, have some financial numbers in them, the members vote on it, and it basically allows the government to keep up and running for the interim. So as we have not seen a budget yet, and Jason Kenney's government is promising a budget in the fall, there needs to be a way to keep government open and keep the bills getting paid and invoices being submitted and all that fun stuff. So these supply bills will ensure the government is able to keep up and running. And for the very the fans of numbers, if they really wanted, they could dig through these things to get some insight into what the province's finances look like right now. And numbers aren't my strong suit, but I can tell you that once these things go ahead, it does mean that the government's going to keep up and running for the summer. So can't complain about that, I'd say.
You know, a contentious issue in the last provincial election, of course, a lot of the NDP were saying, well, if you vote for Jason Kenney and the UCP, it's going to be cut to healthcare, cut to education. Is that still a real concern at the Ledge right now?
Well, it is. Once he took government, what Jason Kenney started saying was, you know, look, when I was in Ottawa, we had a bloated public service and we had to reduce the size of that public service. And it wasn't super pleasant, but we did, and we did it mostly through attrition, he says. So there has been a little bit of a shift in language, I would say, since the election and into now the governing period. And I think that's very much the reality of taking a new government. You don't really know all these things until you're sitting in the Premier's office. And to his credit, I don't believe he made the promise that Doug Ford did, which was that no one was going to lose their job. But the idea, I think, behind this reduction in size of government is going to be that you'll have attrition, you'll have retirements, things like that, you know, are going to lower sort of the overhead and maybe save the government a bit of money. So there is the wedge is being sort of pushed in a little bit, shall we say, and maybe preparing people a little bit for some staffing changes, maybe some cuts, certainly some reductions in staff size. The NDP, of course, is going to seize on that as evidence that this is Klein 2.0. Whether or not that's fair really depends on how successful Kenney's plan of getting this done by attrition really is.
And Albertans should probably prepare for that as well. I mean, Kenney talked about that, the fact that the deficit, the spending is out of control, we're getting deeper and deeper in debt, so cuts have to come somewhere, right?
They do, unless there's a whole whack of money sitting around that the government hasn't got their hands on. I mean, something like a provincial sales tax is certainly not something that Kenney's people have been super fond of, but that is, you know, that is the sort of tool that is on the table in these circumstances. And it was floated back in the Prentice days. So I would be shocked if Kenney had the nerve to introduce a new tax right after cutting the carbon tax. But, you know, stranger things have happened in Canadian politics, I would say.
Tyler, take us inside the legislature for just a moment here and the animosity between Jason Kenney and Rachel Notley. We talked about the desk thumping before. It got a little out of control. Now it's just clapping with the NDP, no more desk thumping. But how about when there's sparring going at it? I mean, they're both seasoned politicians and they know what they're talking about.
Yeah, you know, the theater is still there, I think. You can never totally eliminate that. They can behave a little bit better, but there's still heckling, there's still booing. You know, there's the talking points where they're hounding on each other. And you know, it feels a little bit gentler than it did during the campaign to me, to be honest with you. You know, it feels like this is a return, like you expect this sort of thing in the legislature, I would say. You expect the zingers in question period, the heckling. But the campaign was very personally nasty, I would say, justified or not. I don't particularly come down on either side on that one. But, you know, you saw Rachel Notley and her I should say party at that point, I guess, going very, very hard after Jason Kenney personally. And, you know, that hasn't so much been the case now. There is some real angst over Bill 8, sort of the education reforms that the NDP is calling Bill Hate. So, you know, there are certainly tensions. There is this theater that always goes on. The NDP is still on the attack, of course, but somehow to me, it feels a little bit less nasty than it did sort of mere weeks ago. And I think that's, you know, you walk through the front doors of that institution and you can't help but behave a little bit differently than you do on the campaign trail, I think.
How about some of the other provincial leaders like David Kahn with the Liberals, Stephen Mandel with the Alberta Party? Any talk of them stepping down? They didn't win a seat in the last provincial election. Neither of them did. So is there going to be leadership review maybe, and maybe a new leader for both of those parties?
Gosh, that's a good question. You know, they've been very quiet lately, and so I'm not totally sure what they're up to be honest with you. You know, and the other thing about that is the Freedom Conservative Party, which we do know that Derek Fildebrandt stepped down from, and they need a leader. And certainly, you'll recall in the dying days of the last government and the campaign, there was this rumor that Brian Jean was going to, you know, come swooping back down from Fort McMurray and helm the Freedom Conservatives, and that obviously never materialized, but. You know, Brian Jean's always just kind of in the wings, and he's got a bit of an axe to grind against Jason Kenney. So he's, you know, to add to the list of names of the who's who of Canadian Alberta politics who we're not sure what they're going to do next, certainly his name is out there as well.
Yeah, and I'm wondering even if the Alberta Freedom Conservative Party can exist without Derek Fildebrandt. You know, it's well, can it even exist without?
It very much was the Derek Fildebrandt Party, wasn't it?
Right.
And,
yeah.
But they certainly did not do as well as people expected. So
Right.
Hard to say what's next.
That's true. Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, thanks a lot for joining me once again from Edmonton.
Thanks, Hal.
With Father's Day fast approaching, we want to put the focus on dads. Fathers, however, are sometimes portrayed in the media as being a little bit goofy and sometimes not very bright. That doesn't sit well with a lot of us fathers who really love and care for our families. Fatherhood is very important in today's society. Joining me now to discuss this a little bit further is retired Lethbridge pastor Abe Locke. Abe, welcome back to Bridge City News.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
So what do you think of the media's portrayal of dads being so goofy and not very bright on television? Isn't that disrespectful?
Well, the interesting thing to me is on television, they either portray you as a Sylvester Stallone or a Dagwood. We have the two extremes. We don't find the average man portrayed on television. And I don't quite understand. You're either macho or you're nothing. And I think it's sad, really sad.
It is sad. Now, there's a term called a father wound. I mean, fathers make mistakes, and these can leave lasting hurts in their children, can't they? Let's talk a bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important that the fathers have a leading role in the home. And that leading role gives the children security or non-security.
Structure as well?
Give the children focus or non-focus, purpose or non-purpose. And the father has a leading role in that. And so often, because of our jobs as fathers, we're always gone. And I think that's one of the problems. I think another problem is that we as dads have had a difficult time finding out who we are. I think it's changing in our generation now. I know my son, for example, doesn't have quite that perceptive that I had. But I have a good, Jamie Buckingham, who writes articles, and he wrote an article about Father's Day, and this is what he says to men in my generation. We're pretty tough customers. We don't cry. We don't get scared. We have answers for every question there is, and even answers for some questions that aren't there. My football coach taught me to hit and hit hard. If I whimpered when I got hit, I ran laps. My military instructor kicked the guys who cried and ridiculed the ones who showed mercy. My supervisor on my first day job after college taught me, stick it to them before they stick it to you. We have been raised in that kind of a mentality. That doesn't bode well for teaching and equipping our children to be gentle and gracious and kind and loving and all that kind of stuff.
So do fathers have to be more nurturing, perhaps? Especially those who become stay-at-home dads. Let's say mom is the career woman. She's a lawyer, a doctor, or whatever. She's working at a business person, works outside of the house, and dad has to stay home.
I give a lot of credit to those dads that stay home and do that. I'm not saying that that's what I would do, but that's not the point. But I think all of us as dads need to get away from this macho image in my generation. I think the generation nowadays, that's changing somewhat. But still, our television portrayals are not that healthy. And I would challenge that.
You know, my father used to say, listen, kid, if you fall out of that tree and break your leg, don't come running to me. Right? That was my dad, right? It's like, wait, what, Dad? Okay, let's talk a bit more about the father being a disciplinarian, more so than the mother. How important is that today, perhaps creating that structure for the kids to grow up in?
Well, that is if the dad's around. If the dad's not around, he can hardly be the disciplinarian. I traveled for many years with the Messengers Quartet, and so my wife was home anywhere from 3 to 5 weeks at a time alone. Well, if she wasn't going to be the disciplinarian, and she wasn't one, the problem was when I came home, I told her, I said, I don't want to hear any stories the first day and a half, none, because I don't want to be seen as the disciplinarian in the home. This is a joint effort. And what children will do is they'll come and try and pit one parent against the other.
Oh, that's true.
And parents need to talk about those kinds of things. And, you know, before you make a dramatic decision, I got to talk to dad or I got to talk to mom, just to make sure that they're on the same page. But you see, if I can share an experience, my dad was a pastor and a preacher and all of that kind of stuff. 5 days a week, every supper time, we had a 20 minute to half an hour devotional, where he taught us. And I think a lot of dads are negating that part, not only the discipline part, but that part. And there needs to be unity in that. And
So being a spiritual leader in the house is important.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So Abe, how important is it to say to your children, I love you and I'm proud of you?
I think it's incredibly important. You see, along with the whole idea of discipline is also the support. The discipline needs to be there. See, sometimes we get the idea that just love and everything else goes away. No, you need that and you need the discipline. And I have worked a lot with young people in my early years as a pastor. And there were 3 things that I heard youth tell me all the time. I've never heard my dad say, I'm sorry. I've never heard my dad say, I love you. I've never heard my dad say, I was wrong. You see, and we sometimes think that we as men, when we say those things, then we're not being the macho man. Then we're not being the kind of a guy that we should be. No, that's a relational thing. And we have to have a relationship with our kids. If we can't have a relationship with our kids.
Is a lot of it pride, though, most of the time? The fathers say, you know what, I don't want to admit I'm wrong because dad always knows what's right. That's what he's thinking in his mindset, perhaps?
I think a lot of it's pride, but if I go back to what I said before, I think a lot of it is how we've been trained. For example, I've talked to a lot of young fathers who don't have a clue how to be a dad. Why? Because they've never seen it from their own father. They've never been taught from their own father. They've never had that kind of relationship with their own father. They walk into this marriage thing, that's one thing. But then they walk into a family and have children. That's a total other thing.
So what do you say to a new father then? How do they get started? Like there's no owner's manual about being a father, right? No parenthood manual. Some have tried to write it over the years, not successfully, mind you, because every kid is different, every child is different. But what advice would you give to that new father?
I think we do have a manual. It's called the Bible. And in John 13:17, for example, it says, you know these things, now do them. What's one way to start? I think a lot of dads know more than what they give in for. We don't necessarily need handles. We need a relationship. God said in his word, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Who's my closest neighbor? My family. And so if I look through the Bible and find out what God teaches me, I need to pass that along. And I will have that proper relationship.
How important is it, Abe, to spend quality time with our children, investing in our kids?
Well, like I said before, my dad had a Bible study 5 days a week at supper time. I wonder how many dads...
But outside of the Bible study, I'm talking about playing catch, maybe cooking together, just, you know, having your child unburden themselves to you, right?
Well, I think that's very important. You have to have a relationship. And the playing catch and all that kind of stuff, I think that's very important, but to me, it's still a little secondary. I'll tell you why. I had a young couple that I was counseling over one time, and I just asked them point blank. I said, when I say dad to you, what do you say? And the fellow said, oh, my dad took me to everything. Absolutely everything. He was always there. Very good, very good. I looked at her. She was quiet for a minute, and then she looked at me and she said, oh, how he loved Jesus. There you go. Oh, how he loved Jesus. I think if that comes out, the rest will come. If we just bank on that and forget this, we need to teach them. Let me read you something out of Hosea. This is what God says. This is the Heavenly Father. I taught Israel. I healed them. I loved them and led them with cords of graciousness. And I lifted the yoke from their neck and I fed them. Wow. That's a load of hay there for any dad to read and say, okay, how can I do that?
That's a great example from our Heavenly Father, right?
Beautiful.
What are the consequences of not fathering, Abe? Like leaving the family dynamic behind altogether, or like you said earlier, somebody who's not there for their kids?
Children are left in a vacuum. And what happens in a vacuum? Something else will come in to fill it. And I think this is why a lot of our children turn to drugs. They're trying to fill a vacuum.
Or gangs.
Or gangs.
Right.
Or any of that kind of stuff. Street stuff, television, whatever games they play. Because what you fill your mind with is who you will eventually become. See, and that's a challenge for dads. For example, I am the product, because of my age, of what I became 40 years ago. And for dads that are 30, 40, and so on in that age group, I would say, you are now becoming what you will be. So if you are becoming a gracious, sensitive, loving, kind father, you're going to be more so when you get to be my age. But if you're, you know, nasty and tough and just all that kind of stuff, you'll be more so. You'll be a nasty, old, grumpy kind of a guy when you get to be my age.
What's the most valuable life lesson that your father taught you?
I guess I'd have to say, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. That was number one. But after that, it came to relationships. He would always say to us kids, and I'll never forget it, kids, talk to me. I can't read your mind. I may not agree with you, but I need to hear what you're saying. And I wonder how many dads are free enough and open enough to say that to their kids. Talk to me, otherwise we're not communicating.
What about gifts for Father's Day? How important is the actual gift? Like, some kids like to make handmade gifts, homemade gifts for their fathers. My dad used to get a kick out of that when I do that, right? Back in the 70s when they used to smoke, he used to make an ashtray for them, right? Out of clay, and, you know, not so much anymore, obviously. But how important are the gifts, and what do they say about our relationship with our dads?
I think those gifts are extremely important if they're done personally. And I think to make things for Dad are extremely important. To write a card and express your feelings. My son wasn't so good at writing cards, but my daughters were. I'll tell you, some of the things they wrote in those cards just touched my heart. But I think even more so than that, as I aged, I began to say to my children, I don't want a gift anymore. Give me a memory. Give me something that is a relational memory for me that I can always come back to and that'll stick in my mind. To me, those kinds of things are extremely important. But to me, the biggest thing is a relationship, something personal, a hug, a kiss, that kind of a thing, to me is a little more important than a gift.
To show that there's value in that relationship.
Absolutely.
That
absolutely.
You mean a lot to them and they mean a lot to you, right?
Yeah.
For your kids.
Yeah.
Where do a lot of dads fall short nowadays in the 21st century, Abe? Many fathers you've spoken to over the years, where are dads falling short today?
I think one thing is the senior dad not having taught their son. I have heard from so many guys when I do marriage counseling, you know, and we talk about personal things, and they just look at me wide-eyed. I didn't know that. I never heard that. My dad never talked about that. See, and that leads me to another thing. Are we as dads open to be challenged by our children and thereby open the door to help them? Do we carry each other's burdens? Galatians says that very clearly. Carry one another's burdens. It's talking about the church, but I say, let's do that in the family. Let's carry each other's burdens. And I think men are falling short in that area. I know in my time, we didn't help much in the kitchen because we were out there, we had our jobs. The women were in here, they had their job. Thankfully, that's changing. And I appreciate men taking more ownership in the home as well, working alongside, because that then leads to also disciplining alongside and sharing alongside and teaching alongside.
You know what's interesting is I came from a broken home. My parents got divorced when I was the age of 6. And my father, he actually raised me, and he taught me how to cook, how to sew, how to throw a frisbee.
Isn't that great?
How to swim, how to change my oil, change a tire in a car.
Yeah.
So it was interesting that he taught me a lot of the things that normally your mom would teach you, right?
Exactly.
I mean,
Yes.
my mother, years later, she taught me other things as well, but
Yes.
it was fascinating growing up in that household.
Yes.
So what do you think about dynamics like that, where the father's kind of maybe taking on dual roles?
Well, it's interesting. In my relationship with my father, he was my most significant other. It wasn't my mother. Often it is the mother, like you just alluded to. But in our case, it was my father. I carry his name. I became a preacher like he was, even though I vowed when I got married to my first wife, I would never be a preacher. So when that invite came, we had to have a discussion and a prayer time together because I promised her I wouldn't do this. But I think it's important for those kind of relationships, incredibly important, that the man of the house can communicate with his children.
How important is that relationship with God that helps to influence our relationship with our children, like funneling through?
It's paramount. It's absolutely paramount. Your relationship this way will plateau if your relationship this way isn't where it should be. And consequently, your relationship with God is going to build the relationship that's horizontal. Very definitely.
Retired Pastor Abe Block, thanks again for joining me here in studio today.
My pleasure. I love it.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and have a great Father's Day.